This afternoon, we have two lengthy case studies that I think will illustrate more about these deeper transferences, these nonverbal or pre-verbal transferences. But first I want to talk a little bit about what I call the organizing experience. This morning we talked about 4 different developmental levels of relationship, 4 different levels in which children growing up begin to experience relationships differently, and how we use those 4 different levels of relationship understanding as perspectives to listen to the psychotherapy relationship. Said again, we relate differently to a 4-month-old than we do to a 2-year-old, than we do to a 3-year-old and a 5-year-old, because the material and the communications that children at these different developmental ages are bringing to us and what they expect of us and the way they're experiencing it is simply different. Well, we all had a womb. We all had the project of trying to connect to a mother. We all had the problem of symbiosis, of having narcissistic needs and having them not met, and we all had the problem of growing up in a family where there were various triangles that we needed to try to negotiate. So that these 4 different developmental stages or phases are nothing more nor less than capacities that people have for experiencing themselves in relationship to others. But in the course of psychotherapy, the first level that Freud was able to understand was the level of triangles, and so therefore the Oedipus complex became the focus in early psychoanalytic theorizing. Really wasn't into the 60s and 70s until narcissism began to become understood, so we understood the kinds of transference that a 3-year-old has left over and brings to psychotherapy later in life. And then really in the 70s and the 80s, when we focused in on the borderline conditions, we had writers, Margaret Mahler, Otto Kernberg, Peter Giovacchini, and a number of other writers trying to explain to us that when people are bringing their 2-year-old self to us, we need to be able to listen and respond in a different way than when they're bringing a more developed part of themselves to look at. So on the one hand, we're talking about people who sort of get stuck at certain developmental levels because their developmental opportunities were limited. But on the other hand, we're talking about a normal developmental sequence of experiencing relationships. So this afternoon, what I want to focus on is really the lower 2 levels, or the lowest level, the earliest experiences, because at this point in time, that's, I think, kind of the cutting edge of our field. How do we begin to think about disruptions in development, disruptions in relatedness that happened in the earliest months of life? So that with both of the cases I'll be presenting this afternoon, they will be somewhere between the borderline and the organizing period. Now, I have up here on our computer a few features of the organizing experience I'd just like to review, and I'm not going to say a lot about them today, but just enough to kind of touch on them briefly. When we think about the organizing experience, we're talking about organizing channels to mother's body in utero and organizing channels to mother's mind after birth. So this whole process starts from conception and runs throughout a lifetime, but in it we might talk about the path to the organizing experience. And I gave you the example this morning of reaching and having the tendrils wither because nobody's there, or reaching and having some kind of injury and constricting and holding back. But in either case, the message is never reach that way again. Never go there again. Never relate there again. And so while some people were massively traumatized in infancy, so that huge sectors of their personality were taught never to reach that way again, all of us had experiences of not being met in various ways in our own infancy, and so all of us in intimate relationships feel the pull of deep relatedness again and find ourselves backing off from it. So in this path to the organizing experience, reaching out, there's first of all the quest for reliable connections. We all want to find somebody who can relate to us, who can give us back what we need in a way that satisfies us. And then we can talk about the idiosyncratic use of symbols. And I won't say much about that today, but in my book on organizing experience, I've gone a long ways with that. We know that, if you will, psychotic imagery is rich and full. But any of you who have tried to follow psychotic imagery very far realize it doesn't take you anywhere. Now, it's taken us years and years and years to begin to realize that the images, fantasies, and thoughts that stem from this earliest period don't operate the same way that symbols and images do in a mind that's better developed, or in a portion of our mind that's better developed. That is, the further down the developmental ladder we go, the more towards the concrete expressions go. And so when we look at so-called psychotic imagery or organizing level imagery, there may be many, many different ideas, images, and symbols, but if we try to decode it using our usual Freudian or Jungian symbol decoder manual, okay, we're not going to get very far. And I think as you begin to see the cases today, you're going to see that early on in some of the cases I was struggling with certain sorts of meanings that I couldn't quite get, and it really wasn't until our relationship developed considerably that it finally dawned on me how a certain idea or set of images was being used, that it was being used idiosyncratically. Let me say this again. By the time we have a 5-year-old child, the 5-year-old child systematically, that has had fairly normal development, has learned to express his or her feelings, body states, emotional engagements, relationships in ordinary words and symbols. So by the time we have a well-developed mind, the symbol system that has evolved in the human race over the millennia is used for self-expression. But when we have portions of the mind that were stopped or arrested or not allowed to reach, then there's whole portions of the mind, body, self that have not learned how to express themselves in ordinary sociocultural ways. So, yet we're still dealing with a human being who has good intelligence, good gray matter, the capability of talking, and the capability of using symbols to communicate, but the symbols are not used in the way that other people use them. And so when we're looking at, when we try to listen to people who are expressing very early developmental experiences, if we try to take their symbols and use them in the way that most ordinary symbols are used, we won't get very far. What we have to do is to try to relate, encourage the relationship, notice how they keep backing off of the relationship, and as we begin to grasp what that's all about, the meaning of the symbols will become clear to us. So it's a different way of conceptualizing and working with dreams and symbols, and you'll see that in the cases that we're going on today. Also, there's a use of non-human imagery. Often, and in the case I'm going to show you a little video clip on in a minute, you're going to see here a lot of non-human imagery being used. It's through the bond of the mother, through the symbiosis, that we get a sense of being human beings. And whether, even if our mother was terrible and corrupted us in all sorts of ways or abused us in a variety of ways, if we bonded into that experience, we still know what it is to be human. Even if it's to be warped or damaged human, there's a sense of human. The people who had a hard time bonding will say to us, I live behind a glass wall, I live in a glass bubble, I feel like I'm from another planet, I'm not quite human, I feel more like a robot, like other people have feelings and move and know how to relate, and I don't know how to. So what we find is a predominance of non-human imagery. And there's a preoccupation with body sensations and parts also at this level. It's as though, for most of us, a strong stimulation comes in and a certain part of our body will feel it. Our hand, our ears, we may jump, we may startle, but our mind quickly translates the physical sensation into psychological meaning. But in a person who has had portions of their personality, or large portions, that have never entered into the realm of human meaning, they simply don't experience their bodies in the same way. So that a person will come in and they'll tell us all sorts of things are going on with their body, and if we try to decode that or try to understand it, we'll miss it completely. What we have to state is their body is reacting to stimulation coming in and is not being translated to their minds. So with people at this level, and in both the cases you're going to hear strong physical reactions, and what they are is unprocessed reactions. That is, they are not yet processed by psychology, by psyche, and it's characteristic of early cases. And I have the main thing that we're going to watch is the systematic avoidance and the rupturing of contacts, and we'll see that. And we're going to be working on transformation through connection. I'd like now to skip to a quick video piece of a case presented by Gail Trenberth, a psychologist in Seal Beach. And I think this will introduce us to the kind of experience we're looking at.
Darryl began relating to his therapist, Susan, in a very unusual way. He had no words to express any of his feelings. He didn't have experiences like most of us have, but he could come and sit quietly, and a picture would form. So for some months, they related in pictures. He would come in, not knowing what to tell her, and he felt very frustrated. He said, "I don't know what to say." After a period of time, she got very comfortable with it. She said the atmosphere was like going into a room of people meditating, a lot of strange energy that you didn't know. You knew something very important was happening, but you didn't know what it was. And so, in time, she got used to the images. She described him, she's a bioenergetic therapist, and she describes him as having a schizoid body type. A schizoid body type is elongated with the energy, life energy is not in the limbs, not in the feet, not in the hands. The energy remains more or less in the center of the body, moving towards the head, so that the head is almost isolated from the body. She, being a bioenergetic therapist, wanted to begin making contact with him, but knew that it would be a cautious thing that she must do. So with his permission, she gradually began to touch his forehead ever so lightly and ask him to report his experience. Two things. A part of me, he says, feels good, and I want to stay here forever. I never want to leave. Another part of me says it's not real. I don't feel your touch. It's not happening. He was 45 years old, had been married for 20 years. The marriage was childless. The major complaint that he had was that he found himself attracted to a woman where he worked, a woman in his office. This attraction was an interesting thing because he was a rather shy man. The attraction started with them talking and sharing books. They would pass books back and forth and begin to talk. He reported, "This is the first time I've ever felt understood in my life." He felt attracted to the woman. He felt excited. He looked forward to seeing her. He felt understood. And then the horrible anxiety began. He became terrified. And then he found himself doing everything that he could to avoid her. He reported to therapy, asking the therapist to exorcise the attraction. He did not want to be attracted to this woman. In his marriage of 20 years, he had managed to stabilize the contact problem. That is, he and his wife very early on made very little contact. They interacted very little. There was no sexual relationship at all. And he maintained that he stayed out of duty. The first image that he produced that was very interesting and impelling, he said, "It's like a memory, but it's not a memory. It's like me, but it's not me. There's a little boy in a backyard, and he's working very hard with clay, dirt, clay that he's taken out, and he's molding something, he's sculpting something, and he's working very intense, and he's getting more and more excited until it's perfect. It's a knight. He's made a knight. And he takes it in his hands, starting in the house, to take it to his mother. And he falls, and it shatters into 1,000 pieces. And at that point in the session, the man breaks into sobs. He said, "I could never take anything to her. She was not available. She was never there for me." The next image was he was camping, and he went for an evening walk in the desert. The sky was sepia red, blood red. The horizon was long, and he comes upon some bones, animal bones, in the desert. And he looks at the bones, and he begins sobbing. And in the session he sobs. He says, "I cry for all of the creatures that have crawled the earth that no one has ever known about, that no one has ever loved." And he cried again with his therapist. Once he pictured himself as an infant, a young infant, a baby. And as he began to see himself as a baby, the head began to expand like a balloon, and it got bigger and bigger and bigger, and finally detached itself from the head, from the body, and went off into the sky. Very ugly, he says, very ugly. We couldn't ask for a nicer picture of the schizoid body type, could we? He says, I see myself a car beside a freeway. All of the other cars are moving. They're going back and forth. They have motors. They know how to run. My car looks all right from the outside. It looks the same as all the others. But there's no motor in it. It doesn't know how to run. So then the exchanges began. As you might expect, since this was a referring complaint, he began to have exchanges with his girlfriend. So he and the therapist began exchanging little things. First, he brought tortilla flats. He said, he wanted her to read it, I love this place. I want to live here forever. In return, she brought Kafka's Metamorphosis. This is where you really live. Then he brought in music, Harry Chapin's music. There were several cuts that had a lot of special meaning to him. The first cut, The Sniper. You've probably heard it. I can't sing it for you, I'm sorry. The Sniper, of course, records the event at the University of Texas, the man in the tower that shot 37 people. And so the music goes on with the shots in the background. Mother, I wanted you to love me. I wanted you to nurse me. I wanted you to be there. Mother, I cannot forgive you for your blindness. Mother, I hate you. Until the shots subside with all the deaths. He says it's about being alive. If I touch you, I know that I'm alive. If you touch me, I know that I'm alive. In this case, if I kill you and you kill me, then I know that I've been alive. The next cut he liked from Harry Chapin was called Burning Herself. The therapist wasn't quite sure exactly who was being burned. Was this his mother? Was this his wife? Was this his girlfriend? Was it the therapist? Of course, it was himself. He explains that he burns himself with cigarettes, and the reason is that there is so much pain on the inside, if he can feel the pain on the outside, he knows that he's alive. He burned all things in his office that were personal. Photographs, fountain pens, anything that bore any resemblance to him as a human being. He says, there's nothing personal inside, there shouldn't be anything personal outside. She was, of course, worried about suicide, but it seemed as though he was not suicidal, but more the kind of person who would wither and die, perhaps cancer, perhaps some other kind of fatal disease, because there was no will to live. So then came the day, he came in a little depressed one day, and he says, I had a dream within a dream. In the second level of the dream, he says, I was at work, and we were producing an opera. One of my colleagues was trying to introduce me to her sister. I kept trying to avoid them. I went everywhere I could trying to avoid them. I felt like I was a fish in one of those nets. You know, the spiral nets, the traps where you go, and I was backing further and further away so that I could never get out. And finally she trapped me and she cornered me, and she introduced me to her sister, Amelia. I woke up terrified to the first level of the dream. At the first level of the dream, I heard a harsh woman's voice calling me. I didn't know what to do. I thought it's my mother's voice. Then I thought, no, it's my wife with my mother's voice. And I was once again afraid and woke up. When I heard the dream, I immediately thought of Amelia. He's made contact with a human being, who I'm a sister. And when we take apart the word Amelia, we think of the Latin prefix a, meaning without. When he meets her, he's without a me. When the contact is there, there's no me. He associated to opera. Opera's the most useless thing in the world. And if all he had to do when he went to work was to produce an opera, life would indeed be meaningless. At that point he said, today at work was particularly meaningless. I was feeling particularly useless, and I was feeling depressed about it, and I left a little bit early. I went to a restaurant to have dinner before I came to my session. And on the curb, there's a homeless person sitting on his bedroll, asking for change. I said to him, "Would you like to have dinner with me?" He says, "No, thanks. I've had breakfast." I ask again, "Would you like to have dinner with me?" "No, thanks. I've had breakfast." At this point, he begins to cry. Perhaps he knew something. Perhaps he knows the meaning of life. I'm sorry he didn't eat with me. I could have learned something from him. And he's sobbing deep sobs with his therapist. At that point in the session, the therapist reports the session becomes confused and choppy. He can't focus. He's worried that he doesn't have enough to give her. He doesn't know how to use his time. He begins to become tense. His body becomes tense all over, and he doesn't know what to say. All attempts on her part to soothe him fail. Suddenly the therapist pictures an infant, a very tense baby, that everybody's doing whatever they can to try to soothe the baby, and nothing works. She tells them about her image, that it's as though that was what she was thinking. It's as though he's an infant that's tense, and nobody can do anything to make him feel better. She says, "He's not looking at my eyes." I tell him, "I would enjoy having contact with you, with our eyes. I feel like I'm trying to entice you to look at me." He knows that she wants contact. He knows that she's a human being asking for human contact from him. He says he's very afraid. He would rather think of her as a robot, as an automaton. I know you have people coming to your consulting rooms every day. When you come here to this hospital and other hospitals, you have people as well that are not unlike Daryl. And you can identify with the helplessness that Susan had to feel in this particular situation. When a person experiences themselves as a shattered statue, as a knight in shining armor, trying to take himself to mother, but then at that point, just at the point of contact, he falls apart. Just at the point when he's ready to meet a woman, he falls apart. When he experiences himself as cartoon characters, as a head like a balloon floating away, as a motor car beside a freeway, all of these non-human images, how can human touch reach someone who doesn't at all feel human? And I think that's the question we're going to try to deal with today. The people that we're talking about, they present a great number of different kinds of so-called symptoms, all the way from frank schizophrenia and the manic depressive disorders, schizoid states, autistic states, multiple personalities. Sometimes when we have people that are otherwise better developed, but they fall into states, it could be the eating disorders, the addictions, the character disorders, and then we have to think about ourselves. We all once had a mother that didn't meet us in certain ways. And so the organizing experience is an experience that we all know about. Madness is something that's been known throughout all times and all cultures, but we thought about madness in very different ways. So today we're going to try to think of yet a different way. As you know, in the old days, mad people were burned at the stake, called witches, banished, or allowed to live quietly in some back corner of the barn or the farm. In the 19th century, a more humanistic movement started asylums, started mental hospitals, mental illness. Within our lifetime, the phenothiazines, hospitals. And yet, as we find this movement going closer and closer to seeing these strange people that have been labeled mad, more like ourselves, we become more puzzled. And so today we're going to talk about how madness is universal, how we get in contact with the madness in ourselves, and how we can begin to imagine ways of reaching out and providing human contact to people who otherwise have not been able to utilize it.
All right, the case that I want to read to you now, and again, I have to apologize faintly for having to read it so as to stay with the material and to maintain proper confidentiality and discretion, is a case that I've called Sandy. And the name, actually, Sandy, It's part of a memorial to my colleague Sandy Russell, who was a psych assistant, worked with me, and who several years ago on a July 4th outing with her husband Michael Russell and her son had an asthma attack and died. And so this case, Sandy had studied with me and knew probably more about the organizing experience than anybody else around. And she knew this case and enjoyed it. And so by the time we wrote it up, it's memorializing Sandra Russell. This is the development of a transference psychosis, which is my word is organizing experience. Sandy, a 31-year-old woman who for a number of years always had a great deal to tell me, many stories, many interesting vignettes, arrived one day in the waiting room full of stories she was eager to relate. In the waiting room, she suddenly began to feel something else, an intense desire to be very emotionally present this hour. She somehow understood at that moment that the stories she had wanted to tell me would be her way of not allowing herself to be psychically present in the room. Sandy keenly felt the disappointment of letting go of the exciting stories she wanted to tell me. She slowly began to sink into a very quiet, frightened place. She had been working for some time on trying to allow herself to be more emotionally present, to be fully alive in the room with me. She wanted to feel herself and to feel my presence. But she had so many things to talk about that this was generally difficult for her to accomplish emotionally. On a few occasions, she had a glimmer of it. On this particular day, as she settled down on the couch, she started reporting that she began to feel chaos. With the internal chaos came tears of fright, she said. I stayed with her fears and was able to support her experiencing the chaos of wanting to remain emotionally present, but not knowing how. Sandy was able to clearly differentiate this fear from the other kinds of fears that she's had before. When I indicated that this frightened, chaotic place was a place that she had been working a long time to allow herself to experience, the tears came profusely. With relief, she finally said, "Do you mean that it's okay that I'm in this frightened, fragmented place?" She had interpreted my comments as reassuring her that no matter how frightening and confusing she felt at the moment, that was an okay place to be and that we could be together in her confusion. I pointed out that it was not simply a matter of being okay. The chaos and the fear she was feeling around allowing herself to be emotionally present with me were very real at this moment, which she reaffirmed. It held a sense of present reality that was very different from what she would have experienced had she gone ahead and told the stories that she intended to tell me. For about 10 minutes, Sandy stayed in a quiet state of fear, making occasional quiet comments about physical sensations and her awareness of troubled breathing. Occasionally, I checked in with her to see how she was doing, with her reporting that she was still present and feeling emotionally related to me, but terrified. She contrasted this more quiet, tearful, chaotic fear with a number of previous regressive experiences she's had in which she's felt wildly out of control, terrified, sinking, and falling in a much more urgent and frantic forms. She could see how those were her ways of defending against this quiet place of terror and allowing herself to be emotionally present with another person and knowing how scary it was. At one point, when I checked in with her, she said, "I feel like I'm slipping away." Whereupon, I extended my hand and said, "Can you stay? Can you stay here with me now?" She reached her hand towards mine, and for a brief moment or two, the two of us felt that we had retained our emotional connection with one another. Her comments were to the effect that this was the first time in her life anyone had ever invited her to stay with them, had ever asked her to remain present in the emotional moment. No sooner than she had said that, Sandy began to close in a little more tightly on my hand. She turned on her side, facing more towards me, and with her other hand grasped my hand. I had the distinct sense that something had changed from the experience of simply being together from the time our hands first met. That is, she was holding a little tighter, and she turned a little more and was grasping and clinging a little more, and I felt there was an emotional shift. Gradually, it became clear that her presence was leaving the room. Upon inquiring, she replied, "I'm slipping away. I can't stop it. Something's happening to remove me from you." She began talking about the stories, the unrealness, and how they were and how the way we spent our time today had been more real. But once her emotional presence had started to slip away, she felt it was beyond her power to keep herself present in the room anymore. The emotional contact, which was real, chaotic, and frightening, had gradually moved into a sense of being all together and calm. But that sense in turn set off a retreat. The onset of the retreat was marked by her reaching, grasping, and clinging to me even stronger, more for reassurance than for connection. But the very contact itself and the grasping set off a sense of uncontrollable slipping away. Now I had the opportunity to point out the similarity between the way she was grasping my hand with both of hers and how sometimes she clings to me physically in a hug towards the end of the hours. I said, this clinging, attaching sense is very different from the real chaos and then the ensuing fulfilling moment of contact that we had before you began to slip away, when you were able to stay for a few moments connected when I asked you to. I likened this clinging, grasping, attaching physical contact, which is reassuring, to the stories that she often so excitedly tells, which are also reassuring to her. But both the stories and the clinging contact have a certain unreal sense in that they do not contain the real terrifying emotions of being with another person in the present, nor do they contain safety and calm. Rather, they seem to mask or foreclose the true terror of really being with another person, as well as the comfort that can also be very real. Sandy's comment was, then those reassuring feelings are not quite real? I agreed that they were a way of not allowing the more real feelings of fear as well as comfort to be experienced. She immediately said, oh, now I feel ashamed of the way I've been using physical contact, asking for hugs at the end of the hours, because it seems so phony. I asked, whose mother is speaking now? She responded that it was the mother who frightened her, who broke contact with her, who accused her of being somehow bad. I commented that she had been abusively shamed for many things, for being dramatic, for being phony, and being manipulative, but that that's not the case now. The fears she felt at being alive, vulnerable, and present today had not been received by her mother. Her real presence, with her genuine need for love and connection, had been deflected by her early mother, causing her to withdraw or to assert herself more frantically, as in the clinging and the storytelling modes, in an effort to be received, to feel loved, to feel comforted and safe. Several months later, as the approach to understanding the organizing transference began to occur, let me see here, I've got to skip. I'm sorry, let me start here. What I'd like now to do is to move, I gave you that opening vignette to give you a sense of where Sandy and I finally moved and how she was able to contrast contact for reassurance with connection, which can be terrifying and comforting, and that she began to experience them as very different states. Now the question is, how did we get there? And what was my countertransference in getting us there? So this is the countertransference regression that I had to go through in the course of moving us towards that. So what follows is the first-person narrative of the countertransference experience which emerged. So I'm speaking. The earliest instance of the theme that stimulated my, and actually what this, it becomes clearer, I'm speaking this countertransference regression to Bob Hilton, who I was using as a consultant on the case. Many of you know Bob. He's the director of training, or the person who established the Bioenergetic Training Institute here in Southern California. So Bob and Virginia and I consult with each other on a lot of different cases, but on this one, I was presenting this to him, so I'm speaking to Bob, trying to tell him what's going on with me and where I'm stuck. The early instance of the theme that stimulated my countertransference regression occurred several years ago. I recall a vivid fantasy of this woman, Sandy, about 10 feet away, facing me in a small, subdued crowd, jumping up and down enthusiastically, smiling and waving, trying to attract my attention. I reported my fantasy to her at the time. It was discussed in terms of how she had never felt seen by her parents. In fact, she had never felt that she belonged to them or anyone else. She had always felt somehow different, set apart, isolated, and separated from others, not really a part of a group or relationship. As a result of our analytic work, Sandy now feels that sometimes she belongs to Mark, her longtime boyfriend, and sometimes she belongs to me. Sometime later, the theme emerged of interpersonal intensity. In agonizing over a series of relationships, for some mysterious reason, she felt people seemed somehow to shun her, to silently ridicule her, to turn their backs quietly on her, to fail to reciprocate her friendly overtures. Sandy worried that she was too intense. Intense is a word that seemed to summarize a set of qualities that she felt were received by others as intrusive, aggressive, demanding, challenging, complaining, insisting, being pushy, and so forth. On the one hand, Sandy was proud of her assertiveness as a woman and pleased at her ability to make things happen, to express concern for others, to stand up for what is right, and not be pushed around. But she feared that her intensity drove people away, caused people to be afraid of her or not to like her. She's a bright woman with a keen insight into people, and it seemed that perhaps she saw too much, perhaps she knew too much for her own good. Perhaps she knew too much about what motivated people. It seems she reads people deeply in ways that make them uncomfortable or perhaps provoke them in various ways. But despite these intense, somewhat abrasive qualities, she has many friends. She's well-liked and is respected for her integrity, for her vision, and for her insight. In the context of an ongoing dialogue about her intensity, I had occasion to remark on several occasions how, when she first saw me in the waiting room, sometimes in leaving the office as well, she seemed to take me in to scrutinize me deeply to the point that I sometimes found it uncomfortable. Over the years, I've cultivated a habit in this business of avoiding heavy eye contact and of often averting my eyes so as not to make people feel watched so much. Limited eye contact with clients now feels to a certain extent natural and comfortable to me, especially with analytic clients who use the couch. But often Sandy would pull for eye contact by staring and then follow up her gaze with scrutiny questions about how was I today? Was I okay? What was I thinking? And I found all of this mildly invasive and uncomfortable. On several occasions, Sandy intuited that I was having an off day, and she commented to the effect. Although I had not perceived that I was having an off day myself, it turns out usually later in the day I realized she was right and she had picked it up before I had. I would report this back to her and tell her that she had indeed seen something. She perceived that I was off and that she was very good at perceiving my unconscious moods. I questioned the possible meanings then of her extreme sensitivity. The main conclusion we drew was, as a child, she was so traumatized by her parents' preoccupied, unavailable, or destructive moods that she routinely surveyed people to find out what kind of a mood that they were in. She needed to know if I was okay, how was I feeling, was I going to be emotionally available to her, was she going to be safe with me today, or were there hidden emotional agendas and dangers? In time, the question of her interpersonal intensity that seemed to create some discomfort in others was linked to her need to read the unconscious moods and motivations. I volunteered how uncomfortable I felt being scrutinized visually and emotionally, sometimes felt, but I understood her need to check me out each day, although the need was clearly greater on some occasions. Early in her analysis, Sandy began to ask for hugs at the end of sessions. These goodbye hugs began in the context of aggressive moments when she felt desperate and was not sure how she could leave the session or make it to the next day or through the weekend. Afterwards, on several occasions, I explained my discomfort with the hugs. She assured me that hugs were human and that they expressed connection. And I explained that while I was not committed to total abstinence of touching, like most traditional analysts are, I always felt physical contact of any sort needed to be understood, and that I was always uncomfortable with physical contact that had not yet been understood by two people. Sandy thought analysts were phobic of physical contact and had problems themselves, no doubt fearing overstimulation themselves or sexualization of contact by the client. Hugs at the end of sessions had nothing to do with that. She asserted they were an ordinary part of human warmth and understanding. During periods in which she felt stronger, however, hugs at the ends of the hour could be omitted, I think mostly for me. Sandy did, however, experience a series of powerful sessions in which, when she was emotionally pulling away during sessions, I extended my hand, and I read that vignette to you, and she held on for a while, struggling to maintain emotional contact as well. I later explained what I believed to be a critical and concrete aspect of touch on such occasions, as it served to keep us together when she was losing her sense of me at the moment. In time, I came to sense her desire for hugs and responded accordingly and spontaneously. Slowly, the organizing transference began to be traced or defined in how she was more or less present in the room, emotionally present, or less available for contact. At first, Sandy had believed that she was present and in contact with me most of the time. But slowly she began to realize that she was almost never present in an interpersonally, emotionally engaging way, and that she often had not the slightest idea of who I was. She said on several occasions, "I can feel so much closer to you when I'm not here." Okay? This was interpreted as how difficult it was to actually establish a sense of deep and meaningful interaction with me in which she could actually feel my presence as a real person, separate and different from herself. Sandy had developed a fantasy of me, a fantasy of who I was, and could carry on a reassuring dialogue with me in my absence. But when it came to knowing who I was, in the sense of being able, in the here and now, able to interact with me, able to anticipate who I was and have a spontaneous engagement with me, in that sense, she was often felt quite lost and afraid. She felt discouraged as she began to realize how seldom she was actually present so as to be open and available to me and to ask for me to be open and available to her. I was in time able to draw a distinction between her feeling attached to me in a safe way and her being connected to me in an open and active channels for communication and connection between two real, live, interacting beings. Sandy was at first upset when I applied the attachment connection distinction to hugs at the end of the hour. She didn't like the idea that her reaching out for physical contact stemmed more from an attaching, clinging impulse in need for physical reassurance than from a communication, connecting interaction. I think as you try to think of the clients that want hugs from you or any sort of physical contact or even mental acknowledgement, you begin to realize that there's a great many times in which there's an insistence and you're sort of aware that you go along with the insistence, but there's not a real meeting of two minds and souls. Whereas at other times, two people are totally present. So we were making this distinction, and it was a new one for her. A series of breaches in empathy occurred over time in which Sandy felt emotionally unresponded to by me. Her view was that just when she really needed me to be emotionally present, I would somehow withdraw. She believed that I could not tolerate neediness or dependency, and so I would withdraw or disconnect and go into a cold, critical, imperious place. Now, I could indeed feel the abrupt disconnections. I could feel her despair and her agony and her rage at how she felt that I could not be there for her. But I could not see or experience the pattern that she believed to be present. To me, it seemed that her agonies and her disconnections came upon the heels of some connection that we had made, and I attempted to point this out to her. After several breaches of empathy in this regard, I learned to note that the first inklings of rage, of an intense, invasive, or accusatory demeanor on her part, I did tend to become more silent because I would be puzzled, attentive, and thoughtful, not having any idea where it was coming from, or not understanding the or the meaning of her manner. That is, my subjective sense was that we had just successfully connected, that I had been present for her. So when her response was distress or rage, I was puzzled, and then I pulled back just a bit to try to understand what was happening. My caution and my puzzlement and my increased alertness would then be felt by her as a cold, imperious withdrawal. Afterward, I would be told by Sandy what I should or said have done at these moments that would have made things more empathic. However, the empathic response that I should have been able to give her had not occurred to me at the moment because I had gone into my more abstract tracking mode, trying to figure out what was happening. That is, whenever I sensed sourness, intensity, or invasiveness, I tended to begin reviewing in my head the overall context of our past hours, weeks, or months, while I was listening as carefully as possible for what the present problem was within the overall context of our interaction. Now, while I would be puzzling in this way, she might insist on some sort of an immediate response from me. Her demand for an immediate response would catch me off balance. It seemed that under these conditions, no response I ever gave was satisfactory, and her rage would escalate. Although I'm not sure if any response I might have given would have been more helpful or prevented the escalation, her complaint was invariably that I was inappropriately cold and withdrawing. In quieter times, I seemed to be able to show her the connection and disconnections that I was tracking in our relationship, and she seemed to understand them. But in the moment she would tense up, she would feel locked into a fight with me over how I would coldly withdraw, think her complaints to be transference, blame her for disconnecting, and see her as nuts and myself all right and okay. That was always her experience. There had been a series of interactions that were distressing to both of us. We tended to have different views on what was happening. Sandy believed that I always withdrew when she felt needy and that she had a bad reaction to that. She accused me of refusing to examine or to acknowledge that my faulty responsiveness made it impossible for her to trust me or to trust her analysis. She feared that I was just going to do it again and worried that there was no point in continuing her relationship with me, that I had a basic personality defect, and that I could not keep from rejecting her. It seemed to me that as she would feel something real in the interpersonal connection or in her body in relation to our connection, something internal would occur, causing her to feel that I was cold, isolated, critical, withdrawing, skeptical, and disgusted with her for being so dependent and so needy. I remained open to our differences in view and the possibility that she would prove more right than I with time. My overall tracking for some months had been related to the way in which Sandy could not allow connection and engagement between us to occur and the ways in which she closed it off when it did occur. I could hear her insistence that at these breach moments, the disconnecting problem was with me, not with her. I could see she needed me to cop to her accusation of my inappropriate emotional coldness and withdrawal. And if I did not readily accept the blame for the emotional withdrawal, this further escalated her distress because I was in effect saying, like her parents always did, that it was her fault, that I was right, she was sick, excessively needy, bad, wrong, or pathological in one way or another. I became especially interested in tracking how Sandy managed to produce these breaches by somehow using features of my personality in order to relive the anguish of her infancy and childhood. That's what finally caught my attention in it. I considered the possibility that my tracking on a more abstract plane than she wanted to be heard on could be an intellectualizing defense, a way of avoiding her connecting overtures. Perhaps my intellectualizing defense was activated when, as she claimed, she was most needy. But whether or to what extent I was actually being defensive or my moods made me significantly less available to connect with, I had the distinct impression that Sandy was using the features of my personality to accomplish transferentially determined disconnections. I tried on several occasions to suggest this, but was met with the firm conviction that there was a narcissistic personality flaw in me and that I was trying to blame that on her. Okay? If I was correct in believing that she ferreted out something in me to stimulate or to attach the organizing transference to, how was I to show her that without seemingly replicating her parents' crime of shifting the blame onto her and further enraging her? What was going on, and how were we to sort it out? We were both clear about a history of these disruptions that occur on the day before weekends or holiday breaks. The precipitating incident that led to our next distress occurred on a Friday afternoon. The week had gone comfortably, with Sandy allowing herself more body feeling than usual. I would see her about 4 times a week as a rule, so this is the Thursday session, Friday. I thought Friday might go well also. I was, however, aware that I was going to go backpacking and would not be near a phone for 48 hours. I might need to tell her this, since she often needed to know how I could be reached on the weekends. It seemed to me that I was having a good day. I was looking forward to a beautiful weekend in the mountains with some close friends and a spectacular autumn weather promising. In the waiting room, I felt her penetrating eyes, and I averted mine, as I usually do. In the hallway, she made a full turn around to take me in again, something she had not done before. I felt closely scrutinized and averted my eyes again. The past couple of months, it seemed that she had been aware of watching me in the waiting room since I had made the comment about her intense eyes. On a couple of occasions, there had been an exchange of what I took to be knowing smiles, and we were both thinking about eye contact and what that might be about for both of us. In an instant, as I was all reviewing this in my mind, and I was thinking, it's Friday. She's had an intense week of basically good connection with me. She's had a lot of nice body feelings with me. And so she's somehow forcing me to disconnect, to pull back from this intense scrutiny for the weekend. I feel penetrated, and I sort of knee-jerk withdraw. And I was thinking, she knows that about me. And so with the weekend coming up, she's attempting either to break a potential connection or to prevent one from occurring by using my instinctive withdrawal from her gaze. That's what I'm thinking in a flash as we're headed towards the consulting room. In my consulting room, instead of moving directly to the couch as usual, Sandy turns again, faces me, asks if I'm okay. I reassure her I am, but, and here comes the breach in empathy. You're going to love me for this one. But when you scrutinize me, it forces me to withdraw. She was enraged. That's ridiculous. How could she force me to withdraw? There it is again, and I'm blaming her for it. She wants that in writing because no one will believe it otherwise. In attempting to explain further, clearly a mistake in these circumstances, I reminded Sandy of my aversion to her intense stare and commented that if she wanted to connect to me, then that's certainly not the way to do it. She was further angered. I attempted a few other rationalizations that failed, and then I finally lapsed into quiet, waiting to hear it all out and to see if there was some element that I could perhaps take hold of. My silence was further enraging to her. Toward the end of the session, Sandy announced that she had had a great week. She was overjoyed last night, and she wrote an exciting poem which she had brought, and she had wanted to share it with me. She was happy about what was happening with her. She was happy with our work. She was happy with me, and she came to share it all with me today until I ruined it. Instead of waiting to see where she was coming from, I wrecked the session by disconnecting, and she never got the enjoyment of getting to read her wonderful poem to me. Every session the following week, Sandy set up to confront me. I always did this to her. Just when she was ready to connect, I managed to spoil it somehow. I am an unanalyzed analyst. She listed the times I had failed her and then blamed her for being somehow pathological. I have a deep character flaw that I will never get over, so what's the point of her trying to relate to me if every time when she's ready to connect, I wreck it? What's the use of continuing her analysis? We need an arbitrator, someone who can show me my part in all of this. Now, my feeble attempts to talk about our overall context, about her intensity, about eye contact, about her using my discomfort at her scrutiny to achieve disconnection, all of that fell on deaf ears. Sandy was on a rageful roll, and nothing that I could say engaged her in thought about other aspects of what might be happening in our relationship. Her body was drawn up tight, her eyes were piercing, her voice was tense and authoritative, her manner confident and strident. I had done it again, and it had to stop. As she reviewed past instances she believed that I refused to acknowledge my part in, I repeatedly attempted to correct her, to remind her that I had acknowledged how I had failed to be empathic, but that acknowledgement had not helped her. I continued to ask if it's possible for us to notice how she is reacting to my empathic error. Each time she interpreted this as my attempting to blame her, to hold her responsible for what I have done wrong. The attack was amplified on Tuesday with her pulling all the stops of her anger, dredging up every complaint and flaw in my nature that she could think of, and she knew me pretty well, so it was pretty bad. And by mid-session Wednesday, I was weakened, exasperated, and I was banging my hands on the arms of my chair, almost shouting that I did not say she was a bad person, or that it was her fault, and that my response last Friday was, the best one. I didn't say that. I only said that we are different people with different ways of thinking and responding. I had a real personality that responds to things that she did. She may be using my personal responsiveness for her unconscious purposes. I was angry that she persisted in turning everything I said to mean that I was okay and that she wasn't. I was struggling not to defend myself against her harsh attacks, to find some way of validating her feelings, but still she turned my comments into how nuts I think she is, how I think everything is transference, and how I still believe that I have not done anything to deserve her anger or her disillusionment. Towards the end of the session, I was able to say, as sincerely as I know how, that she was absolutely right that I started last Friday's session very badly. She was quieter, and I hoped, listening to what I had to say for the first time. I tried to explain the long-term tracking that I was doing. I said that when I felt her gaze and her immediate demand to know if I was okay, I mistakenly responded on an abstract plane I was considering at the moment, rather than waiting to see where she was coming from. Sandy was having a joyous body experience that week, had written a beautiful poem, and it came to share it with me. So a concrete moment of happy sharing was really what she came for and what she wanted. My error, I said, was in responding from another, more abstract plane than the one she was on. In struggling to explain how, given who I was and our previous discussions about her intense gaze, she could expect me to avert my eyes when she stared at me, I likened it to hugs at the end of the hour that I thought she had previously given an indication of understanding. I explained again that if she wanted to interact comfortably with me, neither of these modes of moving in with intensity, intense contact, was going to work as a way of connecting with me because both of them made me uncomfortable. I had shown her how I could go along with what she wanted, but if her desire was to achieve a mutually comfortable interpersonal connection, given who I was, those means were simply not going to achieve it. This does not make me right and her wrong. It's merely the way I am. The intensity and the physical contact are simply not ways of approaching me that she can always count on favorable responses to. Sandy became quiet and thoughtful and left silently. I hoped that I had acknowledged the nature of my error and how it had indeed prevented me from being with her, and how that replicated the numerous times her parents had done exactly that to her, leaving her isolated and badly damaged as a result. It seemed that Sandy was taking some of this in, and she left the session somewhat subdued. But the next day she arrived utterly devastated. She could see now that I definitely could not be trusted. All along she had believed me. She had hoped that our relationship would be different. She had believed that I could be emotionally honest, but from my response yesterday, she could see that there was no hope. No hope for me, no hope for our relationship, no hope for the analysis, and no hope for her. All I could see was an error in timing. But the fatal flaw remained. I still believed that it was her fault, not mine. Further, I had humiliated her by saying that I had never wanted hugs, that I didn't like them, that they were all her neediness and nothing that I cared for. That it simply wasn't true, she said. She knew that I had engaged warmly in these hugs. Or if it was true that I had hated her need for hugs, then I was dishonest when I had hugged her. I managed not to be too defensive and correcting what Sandy had done today, but I only echoed her despair and how this was exactly the despair that she had experienced all of her life with emotional dishonesty from her parents. She now had discovered me to be as emotionally dishonest as they had been. The most devastating trauma of her childhood was being repeated in our relationship. I had encouraged Sandy earlier in our relationship to go over her concerns with a consultant that we both knew. I brought up that possibility again, this time as a suggestion for a way out of her despair and her discouragement with me. Nearing the end of the session, there was a long silence, and slowly tears began to trickle down her cheek. She was barely able to whisper, "Betrayal, betrayal. What a horrible betrayal." To believe someone is emotionally honest and then to find out later that they haven't been. As she left, I mentioned that I would be home all weekend in case anything came up that she'd like to tell me. By Monday, Sandy was very, very ill with asthma again. Betrayal was the theme. She reviewed her distresses with me. I was allowed to correct her error in timing that she spoke of to my view that I was badly out of tune with her by being on a plane of abstraction, tracking long-term themes when she was wanting to have us together around some concrete happiness of the moment. That seemed better. I was allowed to repeat my belief that we were experiencing being different people, not that I was right and good and that she was wrong and bad. We were struggling in this together, but not as adversaries. Sandy agreed, but she expressed that she felt I was trying to send her away to resolve this with a consultant when she had to work this out with me. I agreed that she had to work it out with me, but pointed out that sometimes a third party can shed helpful light and provide some support. I then related to Sandy the consultation that I in fact had the previous week regarding my work with her. I told her that I had come to understand several things more fully. She listened quietly and intently, but gave little response at the time. I reviewed how I had talked with, I don't think I needed to tell her, I did not tell her at the time who my consultant was, but I needed to talk with my consultant about my dilemma with her. I related that I had shared with my consultant how from her perspective, Sandy's, it looked adversarial, and finally, despairing and bleak as she experienced the horror of emotional betrayal. I demonstrated with my hands banging on the arm of the chair how I had related how angry I had been that she kept misunderstanding me as saying that it was all her fault. I showed her my body freeze frame that had been caught by my consultant banging on the chair. I quoted the empathic interpretation of my plight given by my consultant. Bob said, "Mother, I hate you for not being available to me, for not hearing what I have to say, for misinterpreting my love, for not being there when I need response from you. I thought you understood me, and now I find you don't." It throws us right back to our own organizing experience, you see. Remember I said when you reach out and nobody's there and you finally give up, or you reach out and you get hurt. But it throws us back to our own fragmentation, disorientation, rage, loss, loneliness, whatever happened to us when the mother that we were expecting, hoping for, the understanding that we were expecting, isn't there. And so Bob was able to show me in my body how I was feeling, her not being there for me in the way that I needed her to be. Sandy's eyes grew larger, but she was still silent. I felt she grasped that I was telling her about my regression in our situation, my helplessness and anger, about how fragile and about how pained I had become. I continued talking about my consultation. I relayed how I spoke about what was happening between her and myself was of critical importance, that I was tracking the disconnects on one level and she on another, and we were not meeting, and how frustrating it was for both of us. I mentioned that I had spoken about how I knew something she was doing was absolutely the right thing in raging at me, but I still couldn't understand completely what it was all about. I told her that I'd been sitting in a love seat when I was talking with my consultant, and my consultant observed another freeze frame. I'm going on and on about, I know she's doing the right thing, and I know this is it, and before too long I'm leaning over like this when Bob catches me, you know, in this very regressed place. I showed her how I leaned forward and sideways toward a fetal position with my right thumb approaching my mouth. Our session was drawing to an end. She asked a few questions to be sure she'd understood what I was saying about the oral and the fetal body regression that I was experiencing. I communicated compassion for both of us in the dilemma we were in, and the strength it took on both sides to allow this deep regression to occur at the depth that obviously was happening. My sharing with her my consultative experience and the depth of aggressive stress that our work together was stimulating in me seemed to provide some connecting link, although I could not tell at the time exactly how I had succeeded in reaching her. Several hours later, Sandy left word on my voicemail for me to call, and I reached her mid-evening. She was sobbing on the telephone and barely able to whisper. Her lungs and her throat were unbearably tight and in pain. Her whole body ached. She said she was breaking down, and she began sobbing uncontrollably. She said Mark, her boyfriend, was there with her, so she was okay, but she was very frightened and confused and going crazy. One thing kept running through her mind that she had never told me before. For as long as she could remember, whenever her mother was angry with her, her mother would first scream and yell, but then lapse into a cold, distant, withdrawn silence. Her mother literally would not speak to her for days on end. She was never sure exactly what she had done to produce this awful silence in her mother. But it was icy and it was cruel. it felt like she gets from me when I withdraw into silence. Then she said, now this other part I'm not quite sure about. What broke the cold silence? But it seems like after a week or two, something would happen. Maybe we'd be passing each other in the house somewhere in the hall, and our eyes would catch, and I'd break down. As soon as I'd break down, she'd be okay again. But she would hold out until I broke down. It was so cruel. How could anyone do something so unbearably cruel to a child, holding out until she broke? And I did. I always did. I always broke first, like it was a battle to see who could hold out the longest. And she always won. Even to this day, she says, I have to speak first. I told her I thought something had happened when I shared my own helpless distress with her. She agreed. We talked about it several ways. Sandy was calming down now, glad for the talk. I told her that when she could see my pain, my regression, my distress, something broke. But for once, it wasn't her. When I had told her about my body regression in response to her, she knew that I was connected to her. She knew I had feelings and that I was not her steely cold mother, that we weren't in an awful battle over who was the most sane. She replied, right now I feel a tremendous need to be taken care of, to be physically attended to be held, to be caressed, and to be comforted, like it's been a horrible trauma, and I need comforting. I suggested that she ask for physical comfort from Mark tonight. She asked if she could call me early in the morning. When she called the first thing the next morning, she told me that Mark had held her all night long. First one side of her body and then the other would get freezing cold and be in terrible pain. He was glad to be there for her, and she reminded herself that despite her various frustrations with him from time to time, whenever she's really needed him, he has come through. I commented, he does care deeply for you, and he does have the patience of a mother who holds on until things are okay again. This was not the first traumatic transference repetition with Sandy, nor would it be the last as we worked through this organizing transference together. But in the aftermath of this event, several interesting things were said. She had lunch with a close friend and laid out the whole story of her distress with me and felt very understood by her friend. She realized that for the first time, I did not have to be a perfect person in order to be her analyst. She expressed concern that she had made me feel so bad. I hastened to tell her that I was fine, that my regression was certainly in relationship to her, but that it was as much a part of our work together as was my sharing it with her. I reminded her how mothers must be able to regress in order to be able to be with the distress of their infants, and that we both felt the need to experience this together, no matter how distressing the experience might be for both of us. She said, I do know that, but all those things I said about you, you know they're true. I explained, that was the worst part. You know me too well. But, Sandy pondered, I don't know why I said them all to you so meanly. I have to think about that. I said, you had to remember the way it was, and this is the only way. I know we both wish for pictures and stories that are easy to remember, that aren't so hard on us. It would be wonderful if we could simply and easily agree that you had had bad parents. It would be altogether too easy to simply confront them about their shortcomings, their cruelty, their abusiveness, their cumulative strain trauma they caused you. But this painful re-experiencing kind of memory is more difficult. This cruel, abusive battle, beginning as it did in earliest infancy, can only be remembered as trauma, rage, betrayal, confusion, fear, tightening in your throat and your lungs, and cold pain all over your body. The accusations directed at my shortcomings are for the damage they caused you by your parents being preoccupied with themselves. We then spoke of how fragile her mother must have been to have been so threatened by the relationship demands of a baby. She had always thought of her mother as cold, calculating, strong, and cruel. Suddenly she understood that it was not so, that her mother was desperately clinging to her own sanity. She could only hold on to the false life that he, father, offered, she said. She could hide herself safely in that false life with him. If there'd ever been a choice, if it were him or me, it would have been, kill the baby. The following week, Sandy's sessions were quiet, her breathing calm, and even a couple of times she dozed off on the couch, almost asleep, thinking, dreaming, silently enjoying being with me and not having to entertain me, knowing that I was enjoying her peace and restfulness. I had the fantasy of being a parent lost in timelessness, timeless reverie in a rocking chair with a new baby. The following Monday, there was again, however, despairing rage. It was pointless to continue her analysis. Sandy now knew that she could not trust me emotionally, that I'm fundamentally psychotic like her parents. And I'll never be, my diagnosis is going downhill here, you notice. Would never be able to provide her with the environment that she needed to continue her analysis. You would just let me walk, she says, meaning that I did not care enough about what happened to her, that I would simply let her walk out with all of her pain and her disillusionment. I assured her that I could not prevent her from walking out, but that would be a horrible loss for both of us, even as discouraged as she was with me at the moment. Perhaps it would help if she spent some time going over her problems with me, with the consultant that I had on several occasions suggested. On Tuesday, she wordlessly moved the large wing-back chair she usually sits in, turning its back to me, and sat in silence the entire session. I couldn't tell if this was anger or despair that she was most feeling. Wednesday, she echoed the uselessness of going on with me, the hopelessness of it all. How psychotic I am and how despairing she is. I struggled to stay with her and how awful it is to feel that there's no one to trust and nowhere to turn. I had occasion to discuss in basic terms a few ideas of Frances Tustin and Melanie Klein. It seemed that what she had hoped was that I would be able to restore the intrauterine state of physical at oneness with her mother's body. Again and again, when she bumped into boundaries of myself or others, she was painfully reminded that Eden cannot be regained, that the lost maternal body is lost forever. We discussed the broadest dimensions of how a baby can be slowly led to realize that mother's body is separate and that the baby will not die, and that basic trust is possible even in an imperfect and failing world. In her case, it seemed clear that she was abruptly and cruelly forced into a realization that the necessary and longed-for features of her world were not under her control and that she had been enraged and suffered ever since. Sandy said that she had to hold on to this rage at me and that she was not sure why, but she knew she must not give in. I supported her in this, saying that she should not give in, that she must stay with her intuition. But I was, for the first time, a bit worried that she might actually attempt to end her work with me. Thursday, Sandy announced at the beginning of the session that she was mad. But she looked more confused than angry to me. She declared that this situation was impossibly painful and confusing, that she could not function, that she did not know how she would get through the weekend in this shape. Then came the deepest anguish that I've ever heard from her. Without the slightest hint of manipulative energy to berate me or to get me to rescue her, I can't trust you because you're psychotic and you will emotionally damage me. But I can't let go of you or I'll die. I can't trust you because you're psychotic and you will emotionally damage me. But I can't let go of you or I'll die. There was a brief silence as we both grasped the impact of her powerful words. The truth of her lifelong delusion and pain had finally been spoken, and we both immediately recognized the central definition of the internalized emotional situation in which she had lived since infancy. We talked about it and how significant this definition of her fundamental delusion is. It was like an enormous boil had finally broken and she was flooded with relief. I agreed to call her each day of the weekend. Sandy immediately and spontaneously connected the central dilemma with a series of successful business meeting several months ago that marked the beginning of this lengthy regressive experience. She said, "You kept talking about connecting and disconnecting, and I suppose that's what this is, but when I put it into my own words, it makes more sense to me. I emphasized the importance of her finally being able to state the bind that she's in with me, that I'm crazy, that I may damage her, but that she can't do without me. I added that at least this second time around, maybe I wouldn't be quite so crazy as her mother had been." She smiled. Sandy recalled some years earlier she had attended a weekend birth regression seminar. In fantasy, she had regressed back to the womb, and she had a picture of herself as a hard-boiled egg. All the other eggs were enthusiastically jumping up and down, but she was hard-boiled. I interpreted that this was a picture of her psychic life with the protoplasm hardened from the beginning, prohibiting any emotional growth. She said, "It goes back to before conception. My mother didn't want me to develop at all. It even happened before my father appeared on the scene." Some deep tension had been relived. A way to rethink and re-experience everything was now available to her. In light of this image, I recalled my countertransference fantasy from a few years earlier, in which I saw her amidst a group of others, enthusiastically jumping up and down, wishing to be seen, longing to connect, wanting to grow. Spontaneously, Sandy related this new discovery to a series of distressing situations that have causing her great puzzlement and pain. Now she could see them as somehow arranged by her to prevent contact by experiencing others as untrustworthy, or even using the closed-off or defended parts of others' personalities to get them to do things that would prove that she couldn't trust or relate to them. On the way out, she said, "And there really isn't anybody that I can trust." I said, "No, not in the way that you always wanted to. They are crazy and they may hurt you. But the problem you're stuck with is that even if you can't totally trust anybody, you do need people to relate to and to feel alive with." The fundamental kernel or nucleus of Sandy's character structure had finally been spoken. The turning point in the analysis had been reached. Her infantile trauma had been remembered by being emotionally repeated in the analytic relationship. The internal character structure could now be subjected to a sequence of working through experiences both inside and outside the analytic relationship. The flexibility required for more spontaneous and creative living was then achievable through gaining conscious knowledge and mastery over the somatopsychic structuring of her personality. Psychoanalysis, psychotherapy, cannot restore us to Eden, and it may not cure us much of anything, but analysis can promote transformations that give us increased access to our personal creativity, which allow us to live more fulfilling lives. Thank you.